She's faking it. My mother-in-law's voice rang through the courtroom so loudly that even the court reporter looked up from her keyboard. She stood from the gallery and pointed straight at me as though I were a criminal instead of the woman who had spent 26 years wearing the United States Army uniform. She does this every time she doesn't get her way. My husband, Thomas, didn't even try to hide his smile. That's exactly right, Your Honor. She's trying to delay the divorce. I opened my mouth to answer. Nothing came out. A crushing pressure spread across my chest as if someone had wrapped steel cables around my ribs and pulled them tighter with every heartbeat. I reached for the counsel table, hoping nobody would notice my hand shaking. The room blurred. I could hear my attorney asking if I was all right, but her voice sounded miles away. I took one step, then another. My knees suddenly gave out beneath me. Someone shouted my name. The polished wooden floor rushed toward my face before I hit it. A man from the second row sprang to his feet. "I'm a physician," he yelled as he rushed forward. He knelt beside me, 2 fingers pressing against my neck. His expression changed almost instantly. He looked toward the bench. "Your Honor, she needs medical attention immediately." The judge leaned forward. "Call 911. The doctor didn't even look up. I said call 911 now. For one terrifying second, nobody moved. Every person inside that courtroom simply stared. Then the judge stood so abruptly that his chair rolled backward. "Bailiff, call emergency services. Clear some space." The courtroom exploded into motion. People rushed in every direction. My husband had stopped smiling. The last thing I remember before everything went dark was seeing my mother-in-law's face. For the first time in years, she looked frightened. 3 months earlier, if someone had told me my marriage would end with an ambulance outside a Virginia courthouse, I would have laughed. Not because Thomas and I had a perfect marriage. We hadn't. But after 30 years together, I believed we at least knew each other. Apparently, I was wrong. My name is Margaret Ellis. I'm 52 years old, a retired Army lieutenant colonel who spent 26 years overseeing logistics for military medical units. I wasn't the soldier kicking in doors or flying helicopters. My job was making sure the people who did those things had everything they needed to come home alive: food, medicine, fuel, equipment. When disasters happened, logistics was the difference between chaos and survival. I loved that work. It taught me discipline. It taught me patience. Most importantly, it taught me that people reveal their true character when life becomes difficult. I just never imagined that lesson would one day apply to my own family. Thomas and I met at Fort Belvoir when we were both in our 20s. He wasn't military. He worked as a civilian contractor managing communication systems. He was funny, patient, kind, or at least I thought he was. We built a life together in Northern Virginia and raised no children. Life simply took us in different directions, but we spoiled every niece, nephew, and neighborhood kid who wandered into our backyard during summer cookouts. For years, our friends called us inseparable. Then retirement changed everything. I retired first. Thomas stayed with his company another 3 years before leaving. That's when his mother, Vivian, slowly became the center of our lives. She had been widowed for over a decade and never approved of my military career. According to Vivian, a wife belonged at home, not deploying overseas, not supervising hundreds of soldiers, not earning promotions that occasionally placed me in positions above men. She never said those things directly in public. Instead, she'd smile politely and say things like, "I suppose someone has to do those jobs," or, "It must have been hard for Thomas, sacrificing so much for your career." Little comments, tiny cuts. Over time, they became impossible to ignore. After Thomas retired, Vivian began visiting almost every day. Sometimes she stayed for dinner. Sometimes she stayed until bedtime. Eventually, Vivian stopped calling before coming over. She simply walked in. Thomas never objected. In fact, He seemed relieved whenever she took his side in the smallest disagreements. If I suggested replacing our aging roof, Vivian thought we should wait. Thomas agreed. If I wanted to visit old Army friends, Vivian reminded him married couples shouldn't spend weekends apart. Thomas canceled our plans. It wasn't dramatic. It was gradual, like watching a shoreline disappear one wave at a time. Then came the financial surprises. Thomas suddenly insisted we move money from our retirement accounts. He brought home documents and said they were routine. "Just sign here." I asked questions. He grew irritated. "Don't you trust me?" Of course, I trusted him. He was my husband. Still, something felt wrong. Years in the Army had taught me never to sign paperwork I hadn't read carefully. So, I refused until I understood everything. That was the beginning of the end. Vivian called me controlling. Thomas accused me of treating him like one of my soldiers. Arguments became weekly, then daily, around the same time. My health began changing. It started with exhaustion, not ordinary tiredness, the kind that made climbing one flight of stairs feel like hiking a mountain. Then came dizzy spells, shortness of breath, pressure across my chest that disappeared before I convinced myself it was serious. Thomas dismissed every symptom. "You're under stress." Vivian laughed. "She's discovered that pretending to be sick gets attention." I stopped mentioning it. Maybe they were right. Maybe retirement had simply left me anxious. Maybe after decades of solving everyone else's problems, I didn't know what to do with my own life anymore. I told myself I'd schedule a physical after the holidays, then after New Year's, then after Valentine's Day. There was always another reason to wait. Looking back now, I realize something that frightens me. Sometimes the people closest to us become so confident they're right that we begin doubting what our own bodies are trying to tell us. And by the time I finally listened, it was almost too late. The morning after my collapse in court wasn't the beginning of my story. It was the consequence of hundreds of small decisions, some mine, many not. 3 months earlier, I still believed my marriage could be saved. I remember standing in our kitchen one rainy Saturday morning, coffee growing cold in my hands, while Thomas spread several folders across the dining room table. "These are just retirement adjustments," he said casually. "The financial advisor already explained everything." He slid a stack of papers toward me. "I just need your signature." I looked at the documents. There were references to investment accounts I didn't recognize and transfers that involved nearly half of our retirement savings. "I don't remember opening these accounts. They're new. Why?" He sighed loudly. "Margaret, do we really have to do this every single time? I just want to understand what I'm signing." His jaw tightened. "You've never trusted me." That sentence hurt because it wasn't true. I trusted him with 29 years of my life. I trusted him when I deployed overseas for months at a time. I trusted him to manage our home while I was stationed across the country. I trusted him every time I boarded a military transport, not knowing exactly when I'd come home. But trust isn't blind obedience. The Army had taught me something invaluable. Never sign a document you don't understand. Not because everyone is dishonest, but because even honest people make costly mistakes. "I'm not refusing," I told him quietly. "I'm asking questions." Before Thomas could answer, the front door opened. No knock, no doorbell, just the familiar sound of Vivian letting herself inside with the spare key we'd given her years earlier for emergencies. She walked straight into the kitchen. "What's going on?" Thomas looked relieved. "Margaret thinks I'm trying to steal from her." "I never said that." Vivian folded her arms. "So why won't you sign?" "I haven't finished reading the paperwork." She smiled a smile I'd learned to fear because it always came before something cruel. "You've spent too many years ordering people around." I stayed silent. She continued, "Marriage doesn't work when one person thinks they're the commanding officer." Thomas laughed softly, not loudly, not mockingly, just enough. That tiny laugh hurt more than if he'd shouted at me. It told me he'd stopped seeing me as his partner. He saw me as the problem. That afternoon, I drove to meet my oldest Army friend, Linda Carter. Linda and I had met as young captains nearly 25 years earlier. She'd retired as a colonel and now volunteered with veterans transitioning into civilian careers. The moment she saw me, she frowned. "You look exhausted." "I haven't been sleeping." "That's not what I mean." She leaned closer. "Margaret, you're pale." "I'm fine. You just climbed 6 steps, and you're breathing hard." I laughed it off. Guess retirement made me soft. Linda didn't smile. "When was your last physical?" "I'll schedule one." "When?" "Soon." She stared at me the way only someone who had known me for decades could. "You've always taken better care of everyone else than yourself." She wasn't wrong. For 26 years, I'd worried about soldiers receiving medication on time. I'd worried about wounded service members reaching military hospitals safely. I'd worried about inventory, transportation schedules, emergency supply chains, and countless details that kept operations running. But when it came to my own health, there was always tomorrow. Linda reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Promise me you'll call your doctor Monday." "I promise." I meant it. I truly did. Monday came. Then another Monday. Life always found a way to interfere. Or maybe I let it. Over the next few weeks, Thomas became increasingly secretive. He took phone calls outside. He closed his laptop whenever I entered the room. One evening, I walked into the study to return one of his books. He minimized something on his computer so quickly it was almost comical. "What was that?" "Work." "I thought you retired." He hesitated. "I'm consulting." "For whom?" "It's confidential." That answer made no sense. Civilian consulting contracts aren't usually confidential from your spouse. Still, I let it go. I wish I hadn't. Then the letters started arriving. Certified mail, bank notices, legal correspondence. Most were addressed to both of us. Thomas insisted on opening them before I had a chance. "It's nothing important." One afternoon, while he was grocery shopping, another certified envelope arrived. The mail carrier recognized me and handed it directly to me. Inside was a notice regarding one of our joint investment accounts. According to the statement, a large withdrawal had already been requested. Only I hadn't approved it. And my signature appeared on the authorization form, except it wasn't my signature. It looked similar, close enough that many people might accept it. But after years of signing military documents, I knew every curve of my own handwriting. Someone had copied it. My heart pounded. Surely there had to be some mistake. When Thomas came home, I placed the letter on the kitchen counter. His face changed the second he saw it. "I can explain." "So explain." "It was temporary." "What was temporary?" "The transfer. You forged my signature." "I was going to tell you." "When?" Silence. "I was protecting our future." "No." I looked him directly in the eye. "You were making decisions that belonged to both of us." Vivian arrived less than 10 minutes later. I still don't know who called her. Perhaps Thomas. Perhaps she simply sensed another opportunity. She listened for less than a minute before shaking her head dramatically. "This is exactly why men get tired of marriage." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Your son forged financial documents." "We don't know that." "I have the paperwork." She waved dismissively. "You're blowing everything out of proportion." Thomas looked at me with exhausted eyes. "I can't keep living like this." I blinked. "What does that mean?" "I've talked to an attorney." The room became strangely quiet. "I filed for divorce." I honestly don't remember sitting down. One moment I was standing, the next, I was in a kitchen chair staring at the man I'd loved for almost 3 decades. Not because he wanted to end our marriage. People fall out of love. That happens. What shattered me was realizing he'd already made every important decision without me. The accounts, the lawyer, the paperwork, the future. I had simply been the last person informed. That night, I packed a small overnight bag and drove to Linda's house. She didn't ask questions when she opened the door. She simply hugged me. After a long silence, she finally spoke. "Margaret." "What?" "I don't think this divorce is really about the marriage." I looked at her. "What do you mean?" She nodded toward the folder still clutched in my hands. "I think somebody's trying very hard to make sure you never look too closely at those financial records." At that moment, I still believed the divorce was about betrayal. I had no idea it was also about money, or that my health would soon become another weapon against me. If you've ever served in the military, you learn very quickly that panic is the enemy. You don't make important decisions while your emotions are running the show. You gather facts. You verify them. Then you move. That lesson probably saved my life. The morning after Thomas announced he had filed for divorce, I woke up on Linda Carter's guest bedroom sofa with swollen eyes and a pounding headache. For about 30 seconds, I forgot everything. Then I saw my overnight bag sitting beside the dresser. Reality came crashing back. Linda was already in the kitchen making coffee. She slid a mug toward me without saying a word. "Did you sleep at all?" "A little." "Are you ready to fight?" I shook my head. "I don't want to fight." She nodded. "I know." "Then what do I do?" She looked straight at me. "You tell the truth." Simple words. Military people appreciate simple words. Complicated plans usually fall apart. Truth has a way of holding together. Over the next several weeks, I hired an attorney named Patricia Harris, a former military legal officer who had spent years handling family law after leaving active duty. She listened more than she talked. After reviewing the financial documents I'd brought, she quietly removed her glasses. "Margaret?" "Yes?" "Did you authorize any of these transfers?" "No." She looked back down. "I didn't think so." My stomach tightened. "How bad is it?" "I won't speculate until we subpoena the records." "Is that lawyer language for very bad?" She gave me a sympathetic smile. "It's lawyer language for there's more here than your husband wants anyone to see." That sentence stayed with me, because until then, I still believed Thomas had simply made terrible choices. Patricia wasn't looking at mistakes. She was looking at a pattern. Within days, subpoenas were issued to multiple financial institutions. Thomas's attorney immediately objected, then objected again and again. Every request for records was delayed. Every hearing became another procedural battle. Patricia never seemed surprised. People rarely fight this hard to hide something harmless. Meanwhile, my health continued getting worse. The exhaustion became constant. Walking across a grocery store felt like crossing a football field. Sometimes my vision blurred for several seconds before clearing again. I finally kept the promise I'd made to Linda. I scheduled an appointment with my primary care physician. Blood work, an EKG, more blood work, then referrals to specialists. Every appointment led to another test. The doctor suspected something involving my heart, but they couldn't yet identify exactly what was happening. "Until we know more," one cardiologist told me, "avoid unnecessary stress." I almost laughed. I was in the middle of a divorce involving nearly 3 decades of marriage. Stress had practically become my full-time job. Thomas, however, treated every doctor's appointment as proof that I was exaggerating. Whenever Patricia requested additional time because new medical evaluations were pending, his attorney objected. Their argument was always the same. "Mrs. Ellis is attempting to delay these proceedings." One afternoon, Patricia called me into her office. "I need to prepare you." "For what?" "Vivian," I sighed. "My mother-in-law. She's agreed to testify." "About what?" Patricia slid a deposition transcript across the desk. I began reading. According to Vivian, I'd become emotionally unstable after retirement. I invented illnesses whenever I didn't get my way. I manipulated Thomas through guilt. I exaggerated physical symptoms for attention. By the 3rd page, my hands were shaking. "I've never done any of these things." "I know. How can she just lie?" Patricia folded her hands. "Because she believes it." I looked up. What? Margaret, not every false statement comes from someone trying to deceive. Sometimes people convince themselves their version of events is the truth. That thought bothered me almost more than outright dishonesty. If Vivian truly believed I was pretending, then nothing I said would change her mind. Linda had another theory. She has to believe it. What do you mean? If she admits you're genuinely sick, Linda said, stirring her coffee slowly, then she'd have to admit she ignored it. I hadn't considered that. It was easier to accuse someone of acting than to face the possibility that you'd overlooked their suffering. A week later, another surprise arrived. Patricia called with unexpected news. "Do you remember Colonel Robert Bennett?" I smiled faintly. "The trauma physician from Walter Reed?" "The same one. He treated soldiers from my brigade after Afghanistan. Apparently, he also evaluated you several years ago during your retirement physical. I remembered him immediately. Professional, calm, exceptionally thorough." "What about him?" "He recently reviewed some of your current medical records." "Why?" "One of your specialists consulted him." Patricia leaned back. "And he believes your symptoms deserve much more attention than they've been getting." I felt both relieved and frightened. "Is he willing to testify?" "He already agreed." That caught me off guard. "Without even knowing me well?" Patricia smiled. "He told me something interesting." "What?" "He said military physicians don't stop caring about their patients simply because they retire." That sentence stayed with me, not because it sounded dramatic, but because it sounded true. As the hearing date approached, Thomas grew increasingly confident. Friends told me he'd been saying the divorce would be over in a single afternoon. According to him, the judge would immediately recognize that I was creating unnecessary delays. Apparently, Vivian was telling relatives something similar. "Once the judge hears Margaret's little performance history," she reportedly said, "this will all be finished." I didn't respond. Neither did Patricia. We kept gathering documents, medical records, financial statements, bank transfers, and retirement account histories. Every piece of evidence was carefully organized into thick binders. The night before the hearing, I barely slept. Not because I was afraid of losing, but because I still couldn't understand how the man I'd loved for 29 years had become someone I hardly recognized. Around midnight, Linda found me sitting on her back porch. "You okay?" "I don't know." "You've survived combat zones." "This feels harder." She nodded slowly. "In combat, at least you know where the enemy is." I stared into the darkness. This time, the people trying to destroy my credibility shared my last name. The next morning, I dressed carefully in a navy blue suit I'd worn to military retirement ceremonies, not because I wanted to impress the court, but because I needed to remind myself who I still was. When I entered the courthouse, Thomas refused to meet my eyes. Vivian smiled confidently from across the hallway. Then I noticed someone else, Colonel Robert Bennett, retired now, standing quietly beside my attorney. He nodded once, the kind of nod soldiers exchange before walking into something difficult. At that moment, none of us knew the hearing would never unfold the way anyone expected, because before the truth about the money could be exposed, my own heart would force everyone in that courtroom to confront a very different truth. The courtroom was already full when Judge Samuel Whitmore entered. Everyone rose. "Please be seated." The room settled into an uneasy silence, broken only by papers shuffling and keyboards clicking. I sat beside Patricia Harris, trying to keep my breathing steady. Colonel Robert Bennett sat quietly in the second row behind us. Thomas sat across the aisle with his attorney. Vivian occupied the front seat behind him. She looked completely relaxed, as if she had already won. The judge reviewed several motions before turning toward Thomas's attorney. "You may call your next witness." "I call Vivian Ellis." My mother-in-law walked confidently to the witness stand. She smiled politely as she took the oath. Her performance would have impressed anyone who didn't know her. Soft voice, perfect posture, gentle smile. She looked like everyone's favorite grandmother. Thomas's attorney began with harmless questions. Mrs. Ellis, how long have you known the petitioner? Nearly 30 years. And during those years, have you had many opportunities to observe Margaret? Oh, countless. The attorney nodded. In your opinion, has Margaret ever exaggerated situations? Vivian sighed dramatically. I wish I could say no. She lowered her eyes as though the answer caused her pain. But yes. Patricia remained perfectly still. The attorney continued, Can you explain? There have always been little episodes. What kind of episodes? If Margaret didn't get her way, Vivian paused, she often became emotional. What about medical issues? Vivian shook her head slowly. Every time life became stressful, suddenly she'd be sick. The attorney leaned closer. Has that happened during this divorce? Oh, yes, he smiled. No further questions. Patricia stood. Cross-examination lasted less than 15 minutes. She calmly walked Vivian through dates, financial documents, conversations, and medical appointments. More than once. Vivian contradicted herself. Not dramatically, just enough for attentive people to notice. Still, the larger picture remained damaging. The judge thanked Vivian. She stepped down wearing the same confident smile she'd walked in with. Thomas was called next. He looked directly at the judge. I loved my wife. Past tense, not love, loved. I noticed the difference immediately. He spoke calmly. I tried to save the marriage. What happened? Everything became difficult after she retired. In what way? She became suspicious. He looked toward me. She questioned everything. The attorney nodded sympathetically. How did that affect your relationship? I felt like I was always defending myself. What about Margaret's health complaints? Thomas hesitated for just the right amount of time, enough to appear reluctant. They usually happen during disagreements. Were you concerned? At first. What changed? I eventually realized. He glanced downward. It happened almost every time. He didn't call me a liar. He didn't need to. The implication hung in the air. Patricia's cross-examination was methodical. She established timelines and asked about missing money, investment transfers, and forged signatures. Thomas denied intentional wrongdoing repeatedly. Whenever financial questions became uncomfortable, his attorney objected. Some objections were sustained, others weren't. But one thing became obvious. Thomas had no convincing explanation for several transactions. The judge scribbled notes. I couldn't read his expression. Then Patricia called me. I walked to the witness stand, raised my right hand, and swore to tell the truth. For a few minutes, everything went smoothly. I described my Army career, our marriage, the financial documents, and the growing tension at home. Then Thomas's attorney stood. He smiled politely. Mrs. Ellis? Yes? You've recently claimed several medical problems. I've been evaluated by multiple physicians, but no final diagnosis yet. Not yet. He paused. So today, you're asking this court to believe you're seriously ill even though doctors haven't reached a conclusion. Patricia objected. Sustained. He nodded respectfully. Let me rephrase. He stepped closer. Mrs. Ellis, isn't it true you've postponed hearings because of these symptoms? My attorney requested reasonable continuances while doctors completed testing. And isn't it also true these symptoms often appear during stressful situations? I answered honestly. Stress makes them worse. He smiled slightly. No further questions. He knew exactly what impression had been left behind. The judge looked toward me. Mrs. Ellis, before he could finish, Vivian suddenly stood. She pointed directly at me. She's faking it! Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Thomas didn't even look surprised. He simply shook his head. She pulls this every time. The judge frowned. Mrs. Ellis, sit down. Vivian slowly lowered herself into her chair. The judge looked back at me. His expression wasn't hostile, but he looked unconvinced. I opened my mouth. Your Honor. The words never came. A sharp pressure exploded across my chest, much worse than before. The room tilted. I grabbed the witness stand. The wood felt strangely cold beneath my hands. I tried taking another breath. Nothing. Only pain. The bailiff took one step forward. "You okay, ma'am?" My knees buckled. The courtroom spun wildly. Someone shouted. Another voice yelled my name. Then everything disappeared beneath me. Before I reached the floor, Colonel Robert Bennett was already moving. Years of emergency medicine had made him faster than anyone else in the room. He caught my shoulder before my head struck the hardwood floor. "I'm a physician." His fingers found my pulse. 1 second, 2. His face changed completely. He looked up at the bench. "Your Honor." His voice was calm, too calm. "She needs immediate medical attention." The judge stood. "Do we have EMS downstairs?" Colonel Bennett wasn't listening anymore. He loosened my jacket collar and checked my breathing again. His eyes met the bailiff's. "Call 911. The bailiff froze, perhaps only for a heartbeat, but Colonel Bennett's voice became louder. "Call 911. Nobody moved, not immediately. Every person inside that courtroom simply stared, even Thomas, even Vivian. It was as if nobody could believe what they were seeing. Then Judge Whitmore slammed his hand against the bench. "Move!" Everything erupted. The bailiff grabbed his radio. Court deputies cleared the area. Someone brought water. Someone else opened the courtroom doors. Thomas finally rushed toward me. Colonel Bennett held up one hand. "Stay back." Thomas stopped instantly. "What's happening?" Colonel Bennett never looked away from me. "I don't know yet, but this woman is not pretending." Silence swallowed the room. Vivian's face had turned ghost white. For the first time since the divorce began, she had nothing to say. Outside, sirens grew louder, closer still, as paramedics rushed into the courtroom carrying equipment. Colonel Bennett quietly spoke words that would change the entire case before a single financial document was ever considered. "I believe she's having a cardiac event." And suddenly, the divorce no longer mattered. I spent the next 4 days in the cardiac intensive care unit. Most of that time felt like fragments of memory stitched together by the voices of nurses, the steady rhythm of heart monitors, and the worried faces of people standing beside my bed. The first face I recognized clearly was Linda's. She smiled when she saw my eyes open. "Welcome back." I tried to speak. Only a whisper came out. "What happened?" Linda reached for my hand. "You scared all of us." "Was I?" "You had a serious cardiac event." I closed my eyes. "So they were right." She frowned. "Who?" "I was sick." "You've been sick for months." The tears came before I could stop them, not because I was afraid, but because I suddenly realized how many times I'd been told my own body was lying. Every ignored symptom, every joke, every accusation, every time someone said I was overreacting, it all came rushing back. Later that afternoon, Colonel Robert Bennett stopped by my room. He was no longer acting as the physician who had caught me before I hit the courtroom floor. Now, he was simply an old Army doctor checking on another veteran. "How are you feeling?" "Embarrassed." That made him smile. "I was hoping you'd say better." I almost turned my own medical emergency into a courtroom spectacle. He pulled up a chair. "No." He looked directly at me. "You didn't. They did." I knew exactly what he meant. Colonel Bennett explained that the emergency physicians believed I had suffered a significant cardiac event brought on by an underlying heart condition that had gone undiagnosed for months. Stress hadn't caused the disease, but it had dramatically worsened it. "The symptoms you described," he said, "they were real." "I know that now." "You knew it before." I looked away. "No, I started believing everyone else." He nodded slowly. "I've seen that happen to soldiers." "What do you mean?" "When enough people tell someone they're imagining pain, they eventually stop trusting themselves." His words stayed with me long after he left because they explained something I hadn't been able to understand. I hadn't ignored my body because I was careless. I'd ignored it because the people closest to me kept insisting there was nothing wrong. A week later, Patricia Harris visited my hospital room carrying 2 thick binders. "I thought I'd give you some good news." I laughed weakly. "I could use some." She opened the first binder. The judge indefinitely postponed the divorce hearing. I wasn't surprised. I assume that's standard. "It is." She smiled. "What isn't standard is what happened afterward." I looked up. The judge reviewed several financial documents while waiting for the next hearing, and he ordered additional discovery. "Why?" Patricia slid several bank statements across the tray table. "Because your husband wasn't entirely truthful." I studied the records, transfers, withdrawals, accounts I'd never seen before, one payment after another. "So Linda was right." Patricia nodded. "The money wasn't moved for investment purposes." "Where did it go?" She turned another page. "A private business venture. My husband started a business. He tried to, without telling me, without asking me, using our retirement savings and my signature." Patricia met my eyes. The handwriting expert completed her report. I held my breath. "It wasn't yours." Even though I'd known that in my heart, hearing someone officially confirm it still hurt, not because of the money, but because the man I'd trusted for nearly 30 years had crossed a line I never believed he would. Several days later, detectives from the county's financial crimes unit interviewed me. No one promised criminal charges. No one rushed to conclusions. They simply collected information, asked careful questions, and requested documents. I answered everything honestly. Meanwhile, Thomas tried contacting me, first through text messages, then voicemail, then flowers. I didn't respond, not because I hated him, but because I wasn't ready. Linda screened every visitor. One afternoon, she quietly entered my room. "There's someone outside." "Thomas?" She shook her head. "Vivian." I stared at the ceiling. "What does she want?" "She says she needs to apologize." I closed my eyes. "I can't." "You don't have to." Linda walked back into the hallway. A few moments later, she returned alone. "What did she say?" "She cried." That surprised me. "Vivian?" Linda nodded. "She kept saying she didn't know." I thought about that for a long time. Maybe she truly hadn't known. Maybe she honestly believed I was pretending. But another thought kept returning. When someone tells you they're suffering, you don't have to understand everything to treat them with kindness. A month later, I was finally strong enough to return to court. Walking into that same courtroom felt surreal. The same wooden benches, the same judge, the same witness stand. But the atmosphere had changed completely. Judge Whitmore addressed everyone before testimony resumed. "This court wishes to acknowledge the extraordinary actions taken by Colonel Robert Bennett during the previous hearing." The courtroom turned toward him. He simply nodded. No speech, no recognition sought, just quiet professionalism. Then the judge looked toward Thomas. "Mr. Ellis?" "Yes, Your Honor. I have reviewed the financial evidence submitted since our last hearing." Thomas swallowed. "This court has serious concerns." Patricia stood. Over the next several hours, bank managers testified, financial experts testified, and a forensic document examiner testified. Piece by piece, the picture became impossible to deny. Unauthorized transfers, hidden accounts, forged signatures, misleading testimony. When it was finally Thomas's turn to speak again, he looked nothing like the confident man who had smiled at me weeks earlier. His shoulders slumped, his voice barely carried across the courtroom. "I made mistakes." The judge's expression remained calm. "Mistakes?" Thomas lowered his head. "Yes, sir." "No," Judge Whitmore replied quietly. "Mistakes are accidents." He paused. "What you've described required planning." The courtroom fell silent. For the first time since this nightmare began, the truth no longer depended on whether anyone believed me. It was sitting in black ink inside hundreds of pages of financial records. 2 months after the final hearing, life became quiet again, not the kind of quiet that feels lonely, but the kind that arrives after a long storm has finally passed. I had sold the house Thomas and I once shared. There were too many memories in every room, and not all of them were painful. That was the hardest part. People often imagine divorce as a clean break. It isn't. You don't simply leave a marriage. You leave habits, routines, holiday traditions, favorite restaurants, the chair someone always sat in, the sound of another person's footsteps coming down the hallway. Even when the relationship ends for good reasons, grief doesn't disappear overnight. I rented a small townhouse about 20 minutes from Fort Belvoir. Nothing extravagant, just a peaceful place with a tiny garden in the backyard where I could drink coffee each morning and watch cardinals land on the fence. For the first time in years, I could hear myself think. My cardiologist insisted I slow down. "No more trying to save the whole world," he joked during one appointment. "I'll try." I've heard soldiers say that before. He adjusted my medication and smiled. "I'm serious. Margaret, your heart is healing. Give it the chance." So, I did. I walked every morning. I attended cardiac rehabilitation. I finally accepted that asking for help wasn't weakness. It was wisdom. Linda remained by my side through all of it. One afternoon, while we were planting flowers outside my townhouse, she asked a question I'd been avoiding. "Have you heard from Thomas?" I nodded. "A few emails." "What did they say?" "He apologized." "And?" I wasn't ready to answer. Linda pushed a small rose bush into the soil. "Are you now?" I thought about it for a long moment. "I don't know." A week later, another email arrived. Unlike the earlier ones, it wasn't filled with excuses. It wasn't asking for another chance. It wasn't blaming stress or his mother or the divorce. It simply said, "Margaret, I don't expect forgiveness. I only wanted to tell you that I finally understand how badly I failed you. I should have listened when you said something was wrong. I should have protected our marriage instead of letting fear and pride control me. I am deeply sorry." I read it 3 times. Then I closed my laptop, not because I was angry, but because I needed to decide whether forgiveness was something I wanted to give or something I needed for myself. Colonel Bennett once told me that soldiers sometimes carry invisible wounds long after the battle ends. I was beginning to understand what he meant. Bitterness is one of those wounds. It keeps reopening if you don't let it heal. Several weeks later, I agreed to meet Thomas, not at our old house, not in a lawyer's office, but at a quiet diner halfway between our homes. He looked older, not just physically. His shoulders carried a weight I'd never seen before. When he sat down, neither of us spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, he looked at me. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "No, you don't." He nodded. "I know." There was no argument, no attempt to defend himself. I believed my mother instead of believing my wife. His voice cracked. I kept telling myself you were overreacting because admitting the truth meant admitting I'd ignored you. I looked out the window for a moment. "When I collapsed, I thought you were acting." His eyes filled with tears. "For about 2 seconds." He covered his face. "And those 2 seconds will haunt me for the rest of my life." I believed him, not because it erased what happened, but because regret has a sound. And after nearly 30 years together, I still recognized his, "I forgive you." He looked up in disbelief. "Really?" "I forgive you," I smiled sadly. "But forgiveness isn't the same thing as going back." "I know. Our marriage is over. I understand. I hope one day you forgive yourself, too." He nodded slowly. "I'll spend the rest of my life trying." When we stood to leave, he didn't ask for a hug. He didn't ask for another chance. He simply thanked me. That was enough. A few months later, Linda invited me to speak at a support group for military spouses and veterans going through divorce. I almost declined. Public speaking had never frightened me. Talking about my own pain did. But I went. The room was filled with men and women who reminded me of younger versions of myself, strong, capable, quietly carrying burdens no one else could see. When it was my turn, I stood in front of them and said something I wished someone had told me years earlier. Being strong doesn't mean ignoring pain. The room became very still. If your body tells you something is wrong, I paused. Listen, if someone you love tells you they're hurting, I looked around the room. Believe them until you have a reason not to. And if you're ever forced to choose between protecting your pride and protecting your family, I smiled softly. Choose your family. After the meeting ended, an older Navy veteran approached me. He shook my hand. My wife spent 2 years trying to convince doctors something was wrong with her heart. He looked down. I didn't believe her at first. He wiped away a tear. I'm going home to apologize. That moment meant more to me than winning any courtroom battle ever could, because justice had given me closure, but compassion gave someone else a chance to avoid making the same mistake. Looking back now, I don't remember the divorce as the defining chapter of my life. I remember the people who stood beside me, Linda, Patricia, Colonel Bennett, the nurses who cared for me, the judge who stopped seeing a legal case and started seeing a human being. They reminded me that one person's cruelty never has the final word if enough good people choose to act. If this story touched your heart, I hope you'll take one lesson with you. Never dismiss another person's pain simply because you cannot see it. Sometimes the strongest people suffer in complete silence. A kind word, a patient ear, or simply believing someone may save far more than a relationship. It may save a life. If this story meant something to you, please consider sharing it with someone who needs that reminder today. And if you'd like to hear more stories about resilience, family, and finding hope after heartbreak, I'd be honored if you subscribed and joined me again. The end.